Hello everyone and welcome. So fantasy dwarves have a very stereotypical equipment, meaning that they're going to wear very heavy armors and as main weapons they're going to use either hammers or axes. Now the fact is that most of that equipment is actually pretty absurd to use for a dwarf. Now in this video we're going to see, well, first of all why it's absurd, and then second of all we're going to see what dwarves actually should use as their main equipment. So first of all, we need to figure out what a dwarf even is, because there are slight variations between the exact fantasy worlds for what a dwarf exactly is. Now I think we can all agree that a dwarf is relatively short, that he is tough, and that he lives at least most of the time underground. Meaning that we'll have to think about these things when we figure out what equipment he should use. Now the fact is that if a dwarf is short, that means that most of the attacks coming at him will come from above, because he's generally speaking going to fight taller opponents than himself. He's either going to fight like orcs, elves, maybe even humans. Now he might fight like goblins that are guess around the same size, but most of the creatures that he's going to fight are going to be taller than him. So most of the blows are going to come from above. Now this means that the most important piece of equipment to have for a dwarf is a helmet, because clearly the helmet protects against the blows that come from above, which are most likely to hit your head. And in addition to that, having a helmet on for a dwarf is actually really useful, knowing that he lives underground where there can be falling rocks or stuff like that. Now, what kind of helmet should a dwarf use? Well, knowing that most attacks come from above, the helmet should be designed mainly to stop blows coming from above. Now, this means that he should probably not have a helmet that is very round, but rather a little bit pointy. Reason being that a completely round helmet, like a Roman helmet for example, it is round, but that means it's actually rather flat on the top. So if you get hit straight on the top of the head, which doesn't really happen for humans because, well, they are approximately as tall as each other, but if you're a dwarf, you're actually pretty likely to get hit on the top of the head. If I'm fighting a dwarf right now, this is a dwarf, I'm likely to hit straight on the top of the head. Now, when you have a round helmet, the top of the helmet is going to be relatively flat, which means that, well, first of all, the weapon the taller creature is using has a higher chance of piercing because they're hitting a flat surface, and even if it doesn't pierce, more force is going to get transferred through the helmet into the head of the dwarf. Now if he uses a helmet that's a bit more pointy, it doesn't need to be very pointy, like this is probably enough, but if you use a helmet that's a bit more pointy, the blows are actually more likely to just get deflected and bounce away, meaning that less force will be transferred through the helmet. Now, Dwarven helmets probably don't need that much face protection because, well, normally helmets would need that because you are likely to get like a thrust in the face or something like that. But for a dwarf, if you are to thrust a dwarf in the face, you're thrusting like down here, which you don't really do. So blows are more likely to come in form of a cutting blow coming from above, which means that they're not really going to hit the face too easily. So face protection is less important for a dwarf. Now what you can have is a sort of a rim going all the way around the helmet to well, deflect those blows a little bit further out, so they are less likely to hit the side of your head or the face. So now I'm talking a little bit like about like a kettle hat style of just rim all around, just to stop the blows from coming in and hitting your neck or something like that. They could also have something that you find on the Roman helmet, which is this big back plate here. Now that back plate is supposed to stop thrust that comes from above to hit the back of your neck, because clearly that's a dangerous spot to get hit, and most likely a spot that's not too well armored. So by having that plate, you're actually stopping most of those blows by deflecting them away, and in the worst case, it'll hit the back of your armor. Now, dwarves could use something like that because they are actually pretty likely to get hit by a thrust or something like that coming in from above and actually have a chance of hitting the back of their neck. So basically, they should have some sort of a pointy hat with a bit of a rim around, and then maybe that rim could extend a little bit further out on the back. That's my opinion, and I think that would be the best for protecting from blows from above. And that's just a general style of the helmet. Of course, like maybe like heavier infantry or something like that could have a bit more face protection because you're still it can still happen that you do get hit in the face. Now, if you have a bit more of a heavier helmet that actually protects the face and the side and stuff like that, what I would argue you should do is actually have the advent tail of the helmet extend onto the shoulders. So basically, they should not have sort of a helmet like the Corinthian helmet or a barrel helmet, because these helmets only protect the head. And the fact is that protecting the head is very important, but a blow coming from above is also very likely to hit the shoulders. So having like an advent tail that actually extends out on the shoulders to give them a little bit extra protection can actually be very useful. Now that is if you're talking like heavier helmet, that wouldn't be too easy to do on a lighter helmet. Now let's talk about the armor itself. Now clearly, like plate armor is the one that's going to protect him the most, but I think it's quite unrealistic to think that every single dwarf is going to use a plate armor. And not necessarily because it's expensive or because it's hard to make, because we're still talking about dwarves, which are both rich and good blacksmiths. But it's a bit unrealistic in terms of, first of all, you can't have an army where everyone has a plate armor, because you should still have some like archers or crossbowmen, some bit faster troops or something like that. So having everyone using plate armor is not the best idea. And then you also have the problem that plate armor takes a lot of time to put on. So if you have dwarfs being attacked, they can't use like 10 plus minutes to actually put on their armors when they're getting attacked. They don't have the time to do that, so having an armor that's a bit lighter, that's a bit more accessible for everyone, and that actually quicker to take on could actually be an advantage. Now, what style of armor should that be? Well, we have several options. We have like Brigandine, Mail, Scale Armor, and Lamella. Now, all of these armor would be perfectly usable and would be great options. But could we find one that is like the best to use for a dwarf? So let's start with the Brigandine. Now, the Brigandine, well, it's a great armor, but I think it lacks a little bit of shoulder guards, because as I said, most blows are going to come from above, so the shoulders are actually the most important part of the body to protect. Protecting like the lower down in your body isn't that important. Still good to do it, but it's not the most important part of your body to protect. Now, of course, you could make like better shoulder guards in a certain way for the Brigandine, but like Brigandines don't usually have that, and I don't think it's the best option. Now, let's talk about the Lamella, because Lamella does have great shoulder guards that extend that far down on the arms, so they are actually pretty good at defending the shoulders. That is a big advantage of the Lamella. However, the problem with the Lamella is that it isn't really a great armor on its own. It's incredibly good when paired with mail armor, because then you have mail armor to protect all the gaps, and then the Lamella to protect against heavier blows. But the problem is that on its own it has a lot of gaps and isn't necessarily the best to use alone. Now then we come to mail armor, because well, mail armor is just a great armor overall, and it protects all the gaps and stuff like that. Now it does protect the shoulders well. The problem is that it doesn't absorb a lot of blunt force, so even though a blow might not pierce, it can actually still hurt the shoulders underneath the armor. Now, one great way of solving this is actually by using more of a Roman style of armor, so a Lorca Hamata. Because these armors most of the time have these iconic shoulder guards that actually add another layer of mail on the shoulders. Now that's great for dwarves actually, because then they have double layer of mail on the shoulders to protect themselves from blows coming from above. So that's actually a great addition to like a dwarf mail armor. But could we find something that's even better? Well, what about scale armor? I made a video last week about scale armor explaining why it wasn't so great, but for dwarves it can actually be a pretty good option. You see, scale armor has a lot of problems. First of all, it is pretty heavy compared to the other armors. Now, to be honest, I wouldn't say that's too much of a problem for a dwarf, because well, dwarves are known to be able to have good endurance and be able to carry a lot, so I don't think that's too much of a problem for a dwarf. Then, as I said in the video about scale armor, a blow coming from underneath can actually hit under scales and actually pierce through the armor by coming underneath. Now again, for a dwarf that's not too much of a problem, because most blows will actually come from above, not from underneath. Because again, a dwarf is smaller, so how do you do an attack from under on a dwarf. It's very hard. You could probably do it, but it's not very natural, and you would probably not do it against a dwarf. Now, the main issue of the scale armor, and what I talked about mostly in my video about scale armor, is the fact that it is not very flexible, but still not very stiff. If you take mail, it's very flexible, meaning that it can protect all of the gaps. And if you take lamella, for example, it is stiff, so it can protect against blunt force more easily. The problem with scale armor is that it is kind of in between both armors, so it is a little bit flexible, but not flexible enough to protect all the gaps, yet it is not stiff enough to protect very well against blunt force. However, the fact that the scale armor has some gaps, like I'm talking mainly the armpits, because that you can't really protect that with the scales, I don't think that's too much of a problem for dwarves. Reason being that, again, the blows are coming from above. You're not very likely to get hit in the armpit by a blow coming from above. Not very likely. So the fact that the scale armor has gaps isn't necessarily a big problem. In addition to that, it is also a bit stiffer than mail, meaning that it's going to absorb more blunt force, which is always nice. Then you can also have similar shoulder guards on scale armor to the ones you have on a Lorca Harmaster. It was actually rather common for the Lorca Squaremaster, so the Roman scale armor, to have these shoulder guards to add another layer of scale on the shoulders. Meaning that you basically have double the armor on the shoulders, which is great for blows coming from above. Then another advantage of scale is the fact that, well, if you take mail, for example, a thrust coming at mail has a decent amount of chance of getting caught in a ring because, well, there's all sorts of unevenness and holes, basically, in the mail that can actually trap a certain blade and make it stay there. And the problem with that is that that blade has a certain chance of staying there instead of glancing away. That means that it will transfer all its force right through the armor, meaning that first of all it has a higher chance of piercing it, and second of all, even if it doesn't pierce it, it will deliver more blunt force through the armor. Now on scale armor, because of the way the scales overlap, a blow coming from above will actually very likely just glance away and not do any damage whatsoever, simply because of the way the scales overlap. So in a way, scale armor is bad against blows coming from below, but that's not a problem for the dwarves because they're going to get attacked from above. But the scale armor is really good at protecting from blows coming from above. And therefore, I would say that scale armor, specifically like Lorca Squamata style of armor with the shoulder guards, could be a really good option for dwarves, especially as like medium armor. Of course, clearly you could have some troops wearing even lighter armor, like scouts or something like that, and you could have troops wearing even heavier armor for like really heavy infantry. But as a main style of armor, I actually think that scale armor is a good option for dwarves. And another argument for scale armor is the fact that in fantasy you have dragon scale armor. Now, elves are the most likely to use dragon scale armor in fantasy, but that's actually not really realistic from a practical point of view, because why would a dragon ever go in an elven forest? It has no reason of doing that. A dragon, however, has very, very high chances of encountering dwarves. Reason being that, well, dwarves mine for gold, and dragons are attracted by the gold. So dwarves are more likely to either kill the dragon or live within the same area of a dragon to potentially like pick up scales or something like that, even though I think that would be a little bit risky. But anyways, dwarves are the most likely to be around dragons and actually obtain dragon scale armor, which is also a reason why all the other ones would actually use metal scale armor. Okay, so now let's talk about weapons. As I said, dwarves are very known for using axes and hammers. Now, just a quick note about hammers. The massive big war hammers with gigantic heads you see a lot in fantasy, they wouldn't even be usable in reality, so no one would ever use that. They wouldn't be usable at all. But dwarves are also known to use like the historical warhammer, also called horseman's pick. So that's basically a hammer on one side and then a spike on the other, used for piercing through armor. Now, both that historical warhammer and the axe are weapons that you swing around and not thrust with in any sort of way. Like, you can thrust with an axe, but it's not going to be the most efficient. Now, the problem is that a dwarf being short has also shorter arms. And when you are human, you can actually generate a lot of force in a swing because you have longer arms that will generate more speed. But with a dwarf that has shorter arms, generating that same amount of force in a swing is harder. And therefore, generally speaking, I would actually say that weapons that you swing are worse for dwarves because they can generate a bit less force through them. Then you also have the problem that these weapons are partially blunt weapons, meaning that they have quite heavy heads, meaning that they need to stay relatively short to be actually usable. The thing is that a dwarf, being short, already has a range disadvantage against taller creatures. So if you, in addition to that, give them a short weapon, they're gonna have such a massive reach disadvantage that in a real fight against someone both being taller and using a longer weapon, they will have so bad range that they can barely attack. So actually, as a dwarf, you want to actually use a long weapon to kind of balance out the range. Then you also have the problem that a weapon that you swing around is generally speaking harder to use in tight spaces, meaning that they are harder to use inside dungeons where dwarves actually live. Now, I will say it's mostly the length of the weapon that matters and not so much how you use it, but still, it is harder to use a weapon that you swing around than a weapon that you thrust with. And then another problem with these weapons, the hammer and the axe, is that they will do the most amount of damage on the head and on like the upper body, like the chest and shoulders. How do you want a dwarf to access these parts of the body of a taller creature, like an orc? It is just incredibly hard, meaning that they are going to end up using their weapons at the waist and the legs of their opponent, where the hammer or the axe cannot really do a lot of damage. So basically, using these weapons, axe and hammers, for dwarves is a very, very bad idea because of the three reasons I mentioned. It's just not a good option at all. Now, axe is not a good option at all. However, if we talk about the historical hammer, the historical warhammer, I will say there is a certain logic behind it because the two tools dwarves are the most likely to use are one, a hammer for forging, and two, a pick for mining. So if you kind of combine these two tools into one, you get a sort of warhammer because you have a hammer on one side and a spike on the other. And that way you could imagine that either it's straight up a tool that they, multi-purpose tool that they use for everything, or you could imagine that it is an evolution of a multi-purpose tool into a bit of a better weapon. So I definitely think there is an excuse for the warhammer, but I don't think at all there is an excuse for the axe because, well, they're not especially known for chopping down trees, dwarves. Of course, they do need to chop down trees to get, like, firewood for, well, forging, but that's not the main activity they're actually doing. Now, you could also say that they can use these weapons, so axes and hammers, but in two-handed form, because then they don't lack the reach because they have a two-handed weapon. They don't lack the force too much because of the short arms, because now they're using a longer weapon that they can actually use to get more force. So in a way, that could seem like a good option. And it kind of is, except that now you have a long weapon that you need to swing around, so that's absolutely horrible to use inside tight spaces. So maybe in some situations they could use that, but it's definitely not practical as an overall weapon, simply because, well, you can't swing that around inside tight spaces. So I would say, no, that's not a good option. Now the question is, what should they use? Well, if we think about everything I said earlier, with the fact that they can't swing weapons with a lot of force, they shouldn't use weapons that they swing around because they're impractical inside tight spaces, and so on. They should actually use thrusting weapons. And they should actually use long thrusting weapons to gain a certain reach advantage, meaning that I think that they should use spears. Not necessarily very long spears, just like what would be for human a rather short spear, to still stay, like, usable inside tight spaces. But you know, a spear, no matter the length, will outrange a sword that humans are likely to use. So if you can actually use a spear, you can actually gain the range advantage. And as a backup weapon to use in very tight spaces where the spear is just too impractical, they can have a very short sword. Reason being that that is very practical to use in tight spaces because it's a thrusting weapon and it's really short. And I think that would be the best loadout for a dwarf, basically spear as main weapon and short sword as a secondary weapon, either to use when the spear breaks or is lost, or to use in very, very tight spaces. Another advantage of thrusting weapons is that they're actually pretty good at hitting gaps, especially when you are short and using them to strike upwards at the taller creature, because usually gaps in the armor will be most accessible from below, because that's where the strike is less likely to come from. So that is like the armpits, the groin, the neck or something like that. All of that is rather accessible from below with a thrust. So if you have a dwarf actually using either a spear or a short sword and attacking from below, hitting the gaps will actually be pretty easy. And well, if the opponent is using scale armor, then they can actually really easily just thrust in between the scales and actually pierce through the armor rather easily. So I would definitely say that actually using thrusting weapons, a spear for a bit more open spaces like halls inside their dungeons, and then a short sword for tighter spaces, could actually be the best loadout in terms of weapon for a dwarf. Now, in terms of ranged weapons, they are really known for crossbows. Now, I'll come back to crossbows later. In terms of all sorts of throwing weapons, are basically not the best for dwarves because, first of all, as I said, they have short arms, so creating a lot of force is hard, meaning that they cannot create such good force in a throwing spear, throwing axe, throwing dart, whatever. They just can't create that much force. Then you also have the problem that throwing weapons, as a general rule, have a trajectory that goes really far up and then back down again. Now, the fact is that that's perfectly fine on battlefields, but once you're actually fighting inside dungeons, that can become a problem because the roof is not the tallest, so you can't actually throw any weapon very far simply because the roof is too low. Now, in terms of bows, dwarves have the problem that, again, they have short arms, so they can't draw the bow really far back. So for a dwarf that can only draw the bow back short, it's actually not the best option to use a bow. Now we come to crossbows. Dwarves are known for using crossbows, and that's actually the best weapon in terms of range weapons to use for them. So reason being that, first of all, the trajectory of a crossbow is much straighter than the one of a bow, meaning that underground you can actually shoot a crossbow farther than a bow, because a bow has a trajectory that's relatively up and then down again. A crossbow is a bit straighter, so you can actually shoot farther because, well, you have a low roof, so actually a crossbow can shoot more straight away. Then you also have the fact that the crossbow can be loaded and stay loaded. Now, that is really practical if you're like inside the dungeon and you have to go around a corner to shoot at somebody that is potentially there but you don't really know. If I'm using a bow and I want to go around a corner and shoot at them, I cannot have the bow drawn at all time. That is just impossible. With a heavy bow, I'm just going to get way too tired. However, with a crossbow, I can actually just have it loaded at all time, just slip right around the corner and actually shoot if there is someone there. I don't need to have my bow fully loaded and trying to hold it back. The crossbow is just held back at all time, so that's a big advantage of the crossbow. Now, in terms of the shield, this is where it gets a bit more complicated, because a small shield can be useful for a dwarf because the attacks are coming from above, meaning that a small shield being easier to lift up can actually be useful because you can actually protect yourself from above. A large shield is harder to use to protect yourself from above because it's so heavy. However, a large shield is much better at making formation and is much better for crossbowmen because, well, the crossbowman can actually just use it basically as a Pavis shield and just reload his crossbow behind that while being protected by the shield. And then you could also say that with all the armor the dwarf has to protect himself from above, does he really need a small shield in addition to protect himself? Can't he just use that large shield, a bit like a Roman, just advancing forward and basically not caring too much for the attack coming from above? Maybe. And then you could also have a bit of a like a testudo formation where the guy behind will actually protect the guy in front from above, while the guy in front can just protect himself from the front. See what I mean? It's like a bit complicated to see exactly what they should do. Now, in terms of like medium-sized shields, I would say it's one of the worst options actually, because they are just a bit too heavy to protect yourself from above, yet they are a bit too small to make effective formations and a bit too small for crossbowmen to use as cover. Now, obviously, when I am saying a large shield, I'm talking about a large shield for a dwarf, which would probably be only a medium-sized shield for a human. So it's like, I'm talking large shield for a dwarf, medium shield for a dwarf, small shield for a dwarf, which is smaller than what humans would use. Now, obviously, you could have different troops using different shields, like crossbowmen could use larger shields, and then maybe infantry could use smaller shield, but in my opinion, actually, it would probably be the best to just use large shields. Now, what I will say is probably if they're using a large shield, they should use a rectangular one. Reason being that a rectangular one is better for formation, better protection for crossbowmen, and it also fits better through hallways. Because if I am using a round shields are actually really impractical to fit through doors, because in any way you turn them, they are too wide for the door, meaning that you can't hold them straight and go through the door. You actually need to tilt them to the side to go through. So round shields are actually a bit impractical, so I would actually say that rectangular scutum-ish or pavis-ish shields would be the best option overall, because they are good for formation and the dwarves can protect each other from above and so with the large shields, and they're good for crossbowmen. So anyways, that was in my opinion how dwarves should be equipped. So pointy helmets with a sort of rim to protect against blows coming from upwards, then a scale armor with Roman shoulder guards for extra shoulder protection. In terms of the weapons, I'm guessing the best option would be a large shield, then a spear and a sword for the infantry, and then for like crossbowmen, they should have a crossbow and then a short sword as a backup, because clearly they can't have both a crossbow and a spear. That's a bit too impractical. Of course, like this is only my opinion. Yeah, there could be all sorts of different ways to create the equipment of a dwarf, but I think this one is the best one. So anyways, yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.